Welcome, everybody. Dr. Mark, Premier Life Carmel. Welcome to this week's podcast as we move into the spring and summer months where sun exposure becomes more of an issue. Our topic today is going to be on sunscreen, which is timely for this time of year. One of the things that is so important to understand is that we actually look at sunlight as a vital nutrient. Sunlight actually is a vital nutrient that we cannot live without. Our bodies require sun just as our body requires oxygen to breathe. So there's some confusion, and then there's some information of some common sense related topics around the conversation of sun exposure. So first of all, why does our body require sun exposure? And I think most commonly we're aware that our bodies do require some exposure to the sun because we all know that the sun, when it hits our skin, creates a vitamin D reaction. And vitamin D in our body acts as a hormone, and it's not necessarily a vitamin. And it's important for over 1,300 different responses that our body requires just to function and to keep us healthy. So sunlight is absolutely imperative and required for our bodies to stay healthy. The information then is, well, how much sun exposure is okay and how much is too much? If you look at all the prevailing research that's out now, there's indication that anywhere from 30 minutes to 60 minutes of fairly broad exposure to light. And that is, for example, in your bathing suit or for men being outside in a pair of shorts with no top on. The exposure of at least 30 minutes is what's required to get us what would be equivalent to 10,000 international units of vitamin D, which is a therapeutic dose. So that 30 minutes tends to be sort of a baseline. And there's some indication that even an hour of sunlight exposure is safe and effective, in fact, required, because that is what's going to help with some of the vitamin D that we require for our body to use, but also a lesser known important aspect of sunlight exposure is that sunlight exposure provides direct cellular stimulation for energy production. So this is far beyond just the vitamin D conversation. This goes down to the cellular level, saying that our very cells and the function of those cells to produce energy is dependent on vitamin D as well as direct sun exposure to create that biochemical change in our body. That's why we say sunlight is a vital nutrient. So there is some valid concern of being in the sun too long. But just to add on to that, one of the things that we talk about as far as what's an increased risk for sun exposure and sunburn, or some of the things we concern about as far as malignant melanoma or squamous cell or basal cell carcinomas, which are some of the concerns we have with excessive sun exposure. So some of that has to do with our Western diet. The seed oils that we eat in all of our processed foods, cottonseed oil and canola oils and all of these oils that are very rich in omega-6 fatty acids, those are the ones that are most reactive to sustained sunlight exposure, UVA and UVB radiation. So the UVA radiation is the very deep penetrating one. Those are the ones that get way down into our skin. The UVB is typically the one that we say is involved more with the actual tan response to our skin. So those seed oils that are very rich in our diet, they are a huge risk factor for our sun's exposure risk factors. In other words, the more of those things we have in our diet, the more they're deposited around our body, including our skin. Those are much more susceptible to oxidation. Think of a car sitting outside in the sun forever and how things start to fade. That's the basic concept of oxidation. So as we're out in the sun, we're also subject to that same oxidation from the sunlight. And the more of those bad seed oils, those processed food oils that we are ingesting, the more likely we are to burn, and the higher our risk for those sun exposure risk factors, such as those basal cell, squamous cell, and the melanomas that we're concerned about. Interestingly, if you look at the research on this as well, the global burden of disease related to excess sun exposure is 0.1% of all global burden of disease. Whereas if you look at the information from the National Institutes of Health and the World Health Organization, the risk of disease-causing processes by not having sun exposure is in the 30%. And what that means is our burden of significant disease, and the research is pretty clear that these diseases include things like breast cancer, lung cancer, all sorts of different cancers, as well as things like diabetes. These are all related to low vitamin D levels, decreased cellular activation by the rays of the sun. So there is good information that our current trend of avoiding the sun at all costs is a little overboard and is probably more detrimental than understanding that being in the sun for a sensible and reasonable amount of time actually has health benefits that far outweigh those risks, as long as we're using good common sense for sun exposure. The other thing that we say as increasing your sun exposure over time, or daily sustained low doses of sun exposure, is going to help your body more than getting out in the sun and staying out there until you get a burn. So these repeated high sun exposure episodes where we're burning repeatedly, never allowing our body to adapt to that sun exposure, that UVA and UVB radiation over time, and allowing our body to develop that capacity, those short bursts, high intensity, stay out in the sun until you burn, those are more of our risk factors. So as we're moving forward and as we move into the spring, as we move into the summer, remember, sunlight is a vital nutrient for our body. Our bodies require it to live. So what do we do if we're going to allow that exposure? How do we avoid slathering sunscreen on us all the time? Well, you can wear a hat. We can wear long, loose clothing that's weather appropriate, the summer gear that we can basically cover our skin after we're out in the sun for 30, 45, or 60 minutes. We can start to decrease some of that sunburn risk and some of that skin cancer risk from sun exposure by improving our diets. Again, getting all those processed seed oils out, because those will burn very quickly in people who have a lot of those in their diets. So that's why some people do have a tendency to burn more quickly and more frequently. And for those people, we say, hey, you might not tolerate 30 minutes of sunshine right now. So get out for 10 or 15 minutes and expose your body. Get some of that activity of that vital nutrient from the sun, activating our cells and activating our vitamin D, which is required for so many of the processes to keep us healthy. So what's our options when we do say, hey, sunscreen is not necessarily inappropriate? But that conversation then goes to, we have to understand that many of the chemicals in sunscreens are endocrine disruptors. And no fewer than 9 of the chemicals that we find in sunscreen are actually listed in our government websites as known endocrine disruptors and toxic chemicals for our body. And up to 90% of the adult population is found to have one of these in their bloodstream. That's called oxybenzoprine. It's very common as a sunscreen blocker. It blocks typically the UVB rays. So not only is there this toxic chemicals concern that we're allowing our bodies and exposing our bodies to with sunscreen, there's also the concern of when we use this and then say get into the ocean. Because the other thing that's very clear from the research, with all of our concerns of how we're treating the earth, these chemicals that we're putting on our bodies are also getting into our oceans. And it's pretty clear that we're damaging coral and we're disrupting marine life by these chemicals that are leaching out once we say are on the beach and we're getting in the water with all these sunscreens on. So there's also a fairly big environmental impact with using these commercial sunscreens. So an option would be to use something like a zinc oxide or one of the oxide derivatives that are available as a sunscreen. So those can be placed on the skin. The only recommendation with those is you don't use the sprays. Those sprays have what are called nanoparticles, meaning they're very small particles, so it can actually absorb into our skin. We do not even want to breathe the zinc oxide into our lungs. So using those spray aerosol type sunscreens, no matter what kind it is, you really should just avoid those at all costs. And if you find that a sunscreen is appropriate or you want to use a sunscreen, use something like a zinc oxide or one of the oxide-based sunscreens, because these are much more safe and they're much more appropriate to help prevent these disease processes in our bodies. So I hope that was helpful. As always, thanks for your time. Glad to spend a little bit of time with you this week. And as we move into the summer months, remember, get out in the sun, be responsible. 30 minutes, 60 minutes of sun daily is very reasonable. If you find that that amount of time is creating issues for you because you are burning, then just wear some light, loose clothes. And if you're going to be out in the sun in a sustained fashion and you want to use some sunscreen, don't use a spray. Find one of the oxide-based sunscreens that's very effective, but also safer for us, safer for the environment. I hope that was helpful. Great to see you again. See you next time.